Hello and welcome to Euronews Tonight. Here are our top stories. The toughest sanctions yet. EU countries agree to cut Russian oil imports by 90% until the end of the year. The biggest gains yet. Russian troops now control half of the strategic Donbas city of Severodonetsk in eastern Ukraine.
In the Cube, we take a look at the pain Shanghai has had to endure as authorities announce an end to its 8-week COVID lockdown.
And from the Channel to the Riviera, a group of cyclists cross France in 10 days to raise money for Ukrainian aid. Welcome to the program. I'm Stefan Grobe. The European Union has agreed to a partial ban of Russian oil imports as leaders in Brussels finally reached a compromise deal with Hungary. Finalizing the long-awaited 6th round of sanctions against Moscow, the EU will immediately block Russian oil arrivals to its ports, which represents over 2/3 of total imports. The 27-member state bloc aims to cut all Russian oil by 90% by the end of the year. The agreement was made amid fierce resistance from Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who said an embargo would destroy his country's economy. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen praised the move as an important step forward. And speaking on Tuesday, she outlined plans to end Europe's dependency on all Russian fossil fuels.
You might remember that in Versailles, the leaders decided to phase out the dependency on Russian fossil fuels as soon as possible. We started with coal. Yesterday, in the middle of the night, we decided then to have a ban now on de facto 90% of Russian oil imports to the European Union by the end of the year. So our answer has to be very clear. How are we going to manage and what is the roadmap to really get rid of the dependency of Russian fossil fuels, and here with view to gas? The answer is Repower EU.
For more on this, let's bring in our Brussels correspondent, Maeve McMahon, who covered the two-day summit in Brussels for us. Good evening, Maeve. Great to see you. So the reason it took so long to pass the oil embargo was primarily Hungarian opposition. How did the Orban government finally get on board?
Good question, Stefan. We've been reporting about this Hungarian opposition for the past couple of weeks, with Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, dragging his heels on this proposal, and with the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen even travelling to Budapest a couple of weeks ago to try and get him on board, but to no avail, because the reason you're hearing about unity and a big announcement from Brussels today on that 6th sanction package and a de facto Russian oil embargo is because the EU leaders gave in to the demands of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and essentially Hungary is exempt from this embargo. And we've seen tonight Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, take to social media, take to his Facebook to express his satisfaction. He said, "Brussels victory for Hungary." He said, "We are exempt." Now, we heard from leaders tonight and from the heads of the institutions that they will revisit this Hungarian exemption over the next couple of weeks, according to the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, as soon as the 23rd and the 24th of June, when EU leaders meet here again for an EU summit in Brussels. It's also worth pointing out, Stefan, that Hungary was not the only country to object and oppose this embargo, even though they were the most forceful in their opposition. Countries like Slovakia, the Czech Republic and Bulgaria also expressed concerns about their interests, of course, but they were given some concessions too. Also worth pointing out that just last night we saw President Zelensky of Ukraine join EU leaders via a video link, calling for unity, saying that unity was Europe's strength and squabbles and internal disputes just was a gift for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president.
Maeve, banning Russian oil is one thing, but banning the more important Russian gas is much trickier. Are there any plans in the pipeline, if I might say, to do exactly that?
Absolutely not. That's a totally different discussion, Stefan. For weeks, diplomats have been telling us that's not on the table for now. They're not even close. And EU leaders reiterated that point as well today. That would just be too much for the European economy to hold. We're hearing that it could be potentially next year or the year after. It's off the table for now. But what Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, is putting on the table today was her Repower Europe proposal with 300 billion euros that would focus on trying to wean this continent off their dependency on Russian fossil fuels, starting with coal, now gradually moving to oil, and then one day on to gas. She said she's focusing now on diversification, also on sourcing from more reliable partners. She said the European Commission have a task force now in place. They've been working and meeting with other partners since January, and now that work is all gradually starting to pay off.
All right, Maeve McMahon in Brussels. Thank you very much. Let's see about the Russian perspective now, and for that I'm joined by our correspondent Galina Polonskaya. Galina, good evening and good to see you. I guess the whole story here boils down to one question. How will this oil embargo affect Russia?
Hello, Stefan. Well, we are talking about huge budget losses. That's for sure. Some analysts say that Russia, if this oil embargo takes into action, could lose and it could reduce Russia's most lucrative export revenue. Bloomberg's estimations show that we could talk about 20 billion euros per year loss of this amount. An analyst quoted by the Russian state agency TASS said that the loss could be twice smaller, but still we are talking about huge budget losses, and the revenue from oil selling is about a third of Russian budget, and the EU here plays a huge role. Just in 2021, Russia produced approximately 520 million tons of oil, and 110 went to the European Union. So we're talking at least about 20% of Russia's oil revenues. Russian officials right now are saying that it is Europe which will lose and not Russia, that Russia will try clients abroad, will turn to the east, to China, for example. But I've spoken with Mikhail Krutikhin, a Russian oil and gas analyst, and he told me that this is not that easy, and he also said that this embargo could be a huge blow for the Russian oil industry. Let's take a listen.
The oil and gas industry will start to die. It has already begun to die. Even before the war, oil production in Russia began to decline. And now the embargo will hit, and we can expect that next year Russia will produce half as much oil as it produces now. It will not be possible to send much more to China. All transport routes are operating at full capacity. We get 80 million tons per year, which is all that China receives. Well, if you add a few tankers, you may increase by 4 or 5 tons. But China is not able to replace the 110 million tons that go to Europe.
Some Russian newspapers today quote a Russian permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna, who said that after losing the European market, Russia will find new buyers. But the Kommersant newspaper, for example, spoke with an analyst who said that if Russia finds buyers in the East, it does not mean that it will sell all to them starting from tomorrow. He said that there is no infrastructure, that we do not know what the demand is, and even if there is demand, it is sure that those new clients will ask for huge discounts, which is the case of India right now.
All right, Galina Polonskaya, thank you very much for that update. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry says intense strikes by Russian forces in Luhansk and Donetsk are yet to break Ukrainian defense positions. But as the fighting reaches further towns and villages in the east, more civilians are being forced to flee what is left of their homes. Thomas Hill reports.
Slovyansk, shattered homes and 3 people dead. Russian rockets targeted this city in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk region. People and property all too often caught in the middle. Russian artillery may be targeting Ukrainian positions, but there's little in the way of pinpoint precision in this war. The bombs and bullets also come from above. Russia's defense ministry keen to show their fast jet pilots low-level missions, typically ending with a successful landing. But in Izium, another point on this long front, the Ukrainians are hitting back.
If Europe and the free world loses this battle, loses this war, we are not going to be safe any longer, because we will always be under threat and blackmail from Putin.
Pokrov railway station, and the elderly as well as young families board trains to escape their homes in Donetsk.
3 days ago, the shelter we'd been in for 3 months was hit. Now there is not any cell phone coverage, water, electricity or gas.
They've hung on to their homes and possessions since the invasion in late February. They'll start June, both old and young, with fear and uncertainty.
Sasha Vakulina now joins me for more on the latest in Ukraine. So, Sasha, there are reports of continuing heavy fighting in the Donbas region in the east. How are the Ukrainian defenses there? They seem to be holding off, at least for now.
They have been holding off now for weeks, Stefan, as you said. Now, we have to say that Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, these two places mean a lot to President Vladimir Putin in what he calls the special operation in the war, the full-scale invasion to Ukraine, because taking over them would mean the full control over the Luhansk region. Achieving this goal in the east of Ukraine is the minimum Moscow needs before they might theoretically end this operation and the war in Ukraine. Right before the invasion, he of course also said, Putin said that he is recognizing the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk regions. So this is the particular meaning for Russia. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, the war here in the east of Ukraine has been going on since 2014. And the defense and the resistance we're seeing now by Ukrainian forces in the east also explain the fact that these are some of Ukrainians' most experienced and well-equipped forces. They have been there for 8 years. They know the terrain there, every bit of it, they know every twist and turn there, and they have been protecting all the front line for the past years. This is why we see this experience now in the way they defend the country as well. We also have to say that the way they're prepared and the way they're defending could be judged by the fact that it was at the end of March when Russian forces withdrew from the Kiev region in the north of Ukraine and focused entirely on the so-called battle for Donbas. And yet, 2 months later, we are talking about the battle for Severodonetsk, which is not full of Donbas.
And we've heard about 2 Russian soldiers being sentenced for war crimes in Ukraine. What do we know about them?
So this is what we know. Ukrainian court did sentence 2 captured Russian soldiers to more than 11 years in jail, each for shelling a civilian area in the country's east amid Moscow's offensive. And this is the second verdict handed down in war crimes trials held by Ukraine since the start of the full-scale invasion. Now, today, Ukraine said it identified more than 600 Russian war crimes suspects and started prosecuting around 80 of them. That's according to the country's prosecutor general. I have to say that Kyiv pays particular attention to this persecution and to identifying the alleged war crimes and also to taking them to the court. And today, Estonia, Latvia and Slovakia also decided to join an international investigation team in Ukraine. Now, what Kyiv is saying here, they really want to do their best to identify those who committed those war crimes. But in order to do that in a transparent and fair way, they are inviting indeed all the partners and all the allies to join them to make this investigation truly international.
Sasha Vakulina with the latest. Thank you very much. Up next, we'll tell you what's driving up inflation to a new record high. That's after the break. Welcome back to the program. Inflation is soaring in Europe, and according to some, the situation could deteriorate further in the coming months. And that could potentially increase the gap between rich and poorer nations. Mark Armstrong has more.
Inflation is continuing to soar across Europe, including in the leading economies. Germany's annual rate hit 7.9% in May, according to official figures, the country's highest level in almost 50 years. The main culprit is energy prices that have risen by 38% year on year. But the Federal Office of Statistics says food prices in the Eurozone's largest economy are also up by 11.1%. The office also says Germans' earnings are down by 1.8% in real terms compared to a year ago. The latest report from the International Labour Organization says people are being hit by multiple new and interconnected global crises. As well as inflation, they include supply issues, financial turbulence and the war in Ukraine, all of which is hitting people's pockets hard.
We talk about the need to protect, as you would expect, the most vulnerable, those in most difficulty, the need for social protection to be factored into the way governments are responding. We're arguing for dialogue, bringing together governments, employers and workers to find acceptable solutions in situations which are undoubtedly very difficult, that adds to the legitimacy and acceptability of solutions.
And the bad news is there's little sign of the situation improving anytime soon. In fact, the ILO says things could deteriorate further in the coming months, increasing the gap between the rich and the poorer nations. The ILO says it's seeing a continuation of what it calls the great divergence in recovery trajectories between different income groups. And that, says the organisation, is something that should concern us all.
Shanghai's strict 2-month COVID lockdown is to be lifted at midnight tonight. Let's head over to Rahl in the Cube for more.
China's commercial hub will cast off most of its coronavirus restrictions, with things like public transport reopening and people being allowed to leave their residencies without a special pass. Now, as you can see from this graph, cases peaked around mid to late April and have fallen significantly since then. But it hasn't been an easy road to get here. As you can see from this video, draconian measures were implemented. Whole quarters were sealed off. People found it difficult to get food and even some medical supplies. And this led to sometimes desperate scenes occurring. As you can see here, when, back in April, residents of a building were told that part of their block would be used to house COVID patients. Men in hazmat suits turned up with the word police written on them. People were dragged away, people were arrested. And it brings us to the wider point that this lockdown was extremely painful for people who had to self-isolate, but also people who lost their businesses, and for the country as a whole, as Shanghai is China's economic powerhouse. The lockdown is now over, but there's a fundamental problem of keeping zero COVID policies in a world that's increasingly learning to live with the virus. A study from Shanghai's Fudan University showed that if zero COVID policies were jettisoned, around 1.6 million deaths would occur. And that's quite difficult, even though most of the world is doing this, for the Chinese Communist Party, Stefan, because they have increasingly said that this is a reason why they're better than the West. They haven't had many COVID deaths, and this is why the Chinese approach is better, which means it's a difficult option to try and jettison it.
All right, Rahl in the Cube. Thank you very much. UK's Home Secretary Priti Patel is set to decide on whether to extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to the United States. Assange is wanted in the US for crimes related to classified documents published on his website between 2012 and 2011. The documents revealed potential crimes committed by the US in Iraq and Afghanistan. Human rights organizations have protested the possible move, arguing that it could represent a threat to press freedom globally. The list of UK Conservative lawmakers calling for a no-confidence vote for the country's Prime Minister is growing. MP John Stevenson said that he was deeply disappointed in the illegal parties during the COVID-19 lockdown that were outlined in a report published last week. More than 20 Tory MPs have called for Boris Johnson to resign. And the former party leader William Hague predicted that a vote could take place as soon as next week or the end of the month. Canada is freezing the importing, buying or selling of handguns after a mass shooting left 21 people dead in the school in the US last week. The new bill, likely to pass in Parliament, will allow for the removal of gun licenses from people involved in acts of domestic violence or criminal harassment. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has long had plans to enact tougher gun laws, with earlier plans to ban 1,500 types of military-style firearms and a mandatory buyback program. Up next, how a former French football professional and a group of cyclists want to help Ukraine. We'll tell you after the break. Welcome back to Euronews Tonight. It has taken 10 consecutive days of exhausting cycling from the south of England to the south of France. A group of cyclists braved the elements and some challenging routes, all in aid of humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. Andy Rubini reports.
A team of 9 cyclists led by former professional footballer Sylvain Distin has completed a gruelling 1,300-kilometre trek from Sandbanks in Dorset to Saint-Tropez in the south of France. The epic ride was entirely self-funded, with all donations going towards the Ukraine humanitarian appeal.
We're not going to change the world, but we know that it will bring some peace and comfort to some families. In this group, we all have children. We are all parents. And to see families split up, not knowing if they will be reunited, it moved us all. So that's why we all decided to support these families and help them.
With all those kilometres, did you have any concerns ahead of this challenge?
Oh, I had many apprehensions. I've never had this kind of physical challenge over time, so I was worried about the accumulation of effort. I had no idea how it was going to go. So yes, there was a lot of apprehension. And then every morning when you wake up, after 3 or 4 days, the aches and pains are more and more important. Every morning you ask yourself questions. You wonder if you're going to make it to the end, because it was an average of 130 kilometers per day, 6 hours of cycling. So it was hard. It was very hard.
The challenge was completed in just 10 days as the group faced heavy rain and tough climbs. So far, they have raised over £20,000 and will be hoping to reach their £30,000 target in the coming days.
We'll leave you with a no comment from Kuala Lumpur, where the city's zoo gave a panda a cake made of shaved ice to celebrate its first birthday. Thanks for watching Euronews Tonight. Stay with us.